It is my pleasure to turn the program over to the man who really needs no introduction, Professor Jack Pitney, who's the Roy P. Crocker Professor of Politics. Jack, thank you for being here, and thank you for walking us through this next presidential election.
Okay, well, thank you. As Jill can attest, I've been doing these things since the election of 1988. And I'll actually make some reference to that campaign because it provides a nifty point of departure. So rather than staring at you for the better part of a half hour, let me switch to the screen. So this is a most unusual election in several respects. One, we have the oldest candidates ever. Biden is the oldest ever major party candidate. He's 81 years old, if you haven't noticed. Pretty much everybody has. And Trump is close behind. This year, Trump, born in 1946, will turn 78 years old. This has already been a subject of discussion. Biden had a really good night with the State of the Union. I can pretty much guess not every day is going to be as good with people of this age. And since I'm a card-carrying member of AARP, I'm allowed to say such things. So expect some of the debate in the campaign to be about the ages of the candidate. He is the first former president since Cleveland Cleveland was the last major party candidate to seek to regain the White House. In 1912, Theodore Roosevelt ran as the Progressive Party candidate against his predecessor, William Howard Taft, and Taft's successor, Woodrow Wilson. But this is very unusual. This is not anything that we have lived under. So we have the oldest candidates ever. We have a rematch between a current president and former president. Nobody alive has ever witnessed that before. And Trump is the first major party candidate to run while under indictment. Not just one indictment. We have 4 indictments encompassing more than 90 specific counts. That's quite something. And what's the impact of that? Who the heck knows? Because we haven't had this kind of position before. Without clicking, does anybody have? Okay, I'm gonna run a test here. If somebody can chime in. He is not the first candidate to run while in trouble with the legal system. There was, in fact, a minor party candidate who got 1 million votes while he was serving a prison sentence. Anybody know who that is? Just unmute yourself and jump in.
Lyndon LaRouche.
That was, I don't think he got 1 million votes. He ran, he was...
Eugene V. Debs.
Eugene V. Debs, hooray, yes, Eugene Debs. Woodrow Wilson threw him in the clink for opposing World War I, and he eventually got out. Warren Harding, of all people, commuted his sentence and actually invited him to the White House. We don't regard Harding as a wonderfully nice person, but in this case, he did the right thing and was very gracious to Debs, who had, in effect, been a political prisoner. Another unusual aspect of this campaign is the nomination phase came to a very early close. The Republican and Democratic nominations officially ended last week, pretty much over. Technically, neither Biden nor Trump has enough delegates to clinch the nomination, but we know who the nominees will be, unless, of course, there is a health crisis on either side, which, given the ages of the candidates, is a non-zero possibility. And that's something perhaps people might want to ask about later on. So a bunch of all things going into this, a lot of unusual aspects of the campaign, and in the title of an unsuccessful Warren Beatty movie, Rules Don't Apply. We just don't know what the heck's going to happen. This is not a campaign like any other. Political scientists have cranked in all kinds of models for forecasting the election based on polling data, based on the state of the economy. But those models don't take into account candidates of this age. They don't take into account the very strong possibility that one of the candidates will, in fact, be a convicted felon by election day. Don't take into account many of the other things that are going on in this campaign. So I really don't have a great deal of faith in any of the quantitative models that purport to forecast the results of the election. All we can say right now is that the race is likely to be close. So let's get on the screen here. I'll enlarge it so people can see it a little better. This is Real Clear Politics. The average of polls, as you can see, Trump is ahead in most polls, but not by an enormous margin. The average of recent polls in Real Clear Politics is a lead of 1.7%. Obviously, you'd rather be ahead than behind, but it's the kind of a lead that can disappear quite easily, particularly when we're talking about March of the election year. And if you want an example of how leads can change, we can go right to the election of 1988, which I mentioned before. This is, I remember, Jill, as I mentioned, gave a talk at the ATH about Bush and Dukakis. At this point in the 1988 campaign, Bush had a bit of a lead over Dukakis, but Dukakis pulled ahead, and for much of the spring of 1988, it looked like Dukakis was going to win. Polls tightened a bit, but after the convention, he had a 17-point lead over George H.W. Bush, a 17-point lead. And I think we all know what happened in that election. In the end, Bush won by a pretty substantial margin. In fact, a larger margin than any candidate since then. Bush won a larger share of the popular vote and the electoral vote than Barack Obama in 2008. Things can change. I don't think the polls will oscillate quite as much this time. Voters are much more entrenched. Don't expect swings of 17 points or more. But given how close the race is right now, a swing of 3 or 4 points can make all the difference. That's why I don't think we can be very sure about the outcome of the election. Let me list 5 different ways in which Biden could lose and a couple of ways in which Trump could lose. First, economic crisis. Obviously, the economy has been a big, big problem for Biden. We had 2 years of pretty serious inflation in 2021 and 2022. The inflation was hurtful for a couple of reasons. One, the inflation rates were much higher than we'd experienced since the early 1980s. Those of us of a certain age remember those days without a great deal of fondness. But for younger voters, by younger, I mean anybody, say, under the age of 50, it's the highest inflation that you can remember in your adult life. And that's a problem. The inflation rate has come down in recent months, which is nice. However, prices are much higher than they were 4 years ago. And that's the metric that people are thinking about. So when economists say inflation is coming down, normal people in line at the supermarket are saying, what the heck are you talking about? Prices are a lot higher than they were. And that's the variable that could influence how they vote. Maybe people will get more accustomed to the higher level of prices in the months ahead, particularly if the inflation rate stays moderate. But that's going to continue to be a problem for the incumbent administration. There could be another economic crisis. Who knows what it could be? It could be something stemming from a foreign crisis. It could be something stemming from another pandemic. It could be something happens on the stock market as a result of a cyber attack. Who knows? But any kind of economic crisis could fundamentally change the course of the campaign in the months ahead. Other kinds of crises, over and apart from the impact on the economy, could also have an impact on the election. Remember, 4 years ago to this day, to this very day, We were talking about the impact of President Trump's speech the night before about the pandemic, in which he talked about shutting down travel from Europe. And everybody was confused about what American policy would be. The markets tanked. People were scrambling to see what would happen next. And very soon, CMC and pretty much all colleges across the country would shut down live classes, and we'd go to the internet as we're doing right now. Who knows what kind of crisis could happen? Obviously, events in the Middle East have been problematic for President Biden. There's some progressive Democrats, Arab Americans, Muslim Americans, who strongly disagree with the president's support for Israel. That had some impact on the Michigan primary, could have an impact in some states in the general election. We could have an additional crisis at the border. The border is a big problem for Biden as it is, but if there is an outbreak of massive violence at the border, that immensely raises the salience of the issue and the stakes of the issue. That is also potentially a big problem for the president. We have no idea whether something like that is going to happen. But if I were a White House operative, it's the kind of thing that would keep me up at night. A scandal. To quote all the king's men, man is conceived in sin and born in corruption, and he passeth from the stink of the deity to the stench of the shroud. There is always something. There's always the potential for a new scandal. I'm not talking about Hunter Biden. That's kind of fizzled out, particularly when one of the informants turned out to be extremely unreliable. The hearing today about Biden and the government documents, again, didn't really produce any silver bullets for the Republicans. But there's always the chance that something else could emerge. That is another thing that keeps operatives awake at night. A spoiler candidacy. This is something that Biden has probably more to fear from than President Trump. Very close election. If a third-party candidate takes 2, 3, 4 points away from Biden, Trump will probably win. Who could those candidates be? Well, there is so-called no labels organization. They are getting on the ballot in some states. They're still trying to find a candidate, but if they find somebody with some cross-party appeal, they could pull votes. That person could pull votes from Biden. Cornel West running as an independent candidate. If you're not familiar with his academic works, you may recognize him from his appearances in the Matrix movies. He's not going to be elected president, but if he gets 2 or 3% of the vote in places such as Michigan, if people upset with the administration's Middle East policies go with him, they could cost him Michigan, and that could tip the election. That's a problem. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Now, this is more of a wild card. On the one hand, Robert F. Kennedy is a notorious anti-vaxxer. His articles on vaccines have been discredited, retracted. Nevertheless, he has a following, and that potentially could hurt Trump on the one hand, because the anti-vaxxers tend to support Trump. On the other hand, his name's Kennedy. In fact, a lot of people know one thing about Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and that his name is Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And they think of him as a Kennedy, even though members of his family have already denounced him in public. Nevertheless, the Kennedy name could win him a couple of points from the Democratic nominee, President Biden. And that is another problem for President Biden. Then finally, as I mentioned before, age and health. Joe Biden, 81. Survivor of 2 life-threatening brain aneurysms. He seems to be in good health. He gave a good performance at the State of the Union. There's always the chance that something could happen. Donald Trump, he'll turn 78, seems to project a little more vigor, but in recent appearances, he has been making some gaffes that suggest that he's slowed down a bit. And given his eating habits, there's always the possibility of a health crisis for him. So we just don't know how that's going to work out. When it comes to Trump and The age issue, his opponents are putting together supercuts of various flubs and garbles during his speeches. Here's an example. I'll only play a couple minutes of it.
That is no longer admired, respected, or listened to will repeat your. Anytime I start talking, they take the red light off. Look, he can't campaign. He can't campaign. He can't speak. So we call it migrant crime. I came up with that name because I come up with a lot of good names. You see Maduro, Venezuela, it's unbelievable. Is going to the border, doing a show. Sean Hannity, good man, Sean Hannity. We'll demolish the deep state. We will expel the warmongers. Production in the United States, country, even Argentina, they went MAGA. You know Argentina, great guy. He's a big Trump guy. He loves Trump. I love him because he loves Trump. When he called, I took his call on me. Anybody that loves me, I like them. Biden border will, well, you know this, right? The Biden border bill. I'm thrilled to be back in the beautiful Virginia. We went to the last two total. Last Tuesday, Michigan total was a record. Like, ding, boom. This is me. I hear, bing. You.
Okay, you get the idea there. So every time Biden makes a gaffe or a stumble, do expect that you're going to be hearing a lot from supporters of President Trump. Similarly, whenever Trump makes a Trump makes a gaffe, you're going to hear the same from supporters of President Biden. The criminal conviction, what impact is that going to have on the voters? We have no idea. On the one hand, his indictment seemed to have solidified support in the Republican Party. Ron DeSantis, a year ago, seemed to be gathering support, and then came the first indictment in New York City, and the margin that Trump enjoyed tended to increase. What happens if there's a conviction? The first trial apparently to go forward will be in New York City about falsifying business records to cover up his affair with Stormy Daniels. If he is convicted in that, how will voters react? We have no idea. This has never happened before to a major party candidate in a presidential campaign. On the one hand, it's possible that supporters of Trump will rally behind him. On the other hand, there are polls that indicate that some voters will simply not support anybody who has been convicted of a crime. One aspect of Trump's legal troubles that perhaps has not gotten a great deal of attention consists of his legal bills. Trump has just, in the past week, essentially taken control of the Republican National Committee. Laura Trump, his daughter-in-law, is the campaign co-chair. And last week, the Republican National Committee defeated a resolution that would have prevented the RNC from paying for Trump's legal bills. Clearly, the motions are, the efforts are in place so that the RNC can serve as a funding mechanism for Trump's criminal lawyers, which is okay for Trump, but not necessarily good for the Republican Party as a whole, especially Republican candidates down ballot. That could have some impact on the race. What else could change? Let me stop the screen share at this point. What else could change in this campaign? There are some polls indicating that Hispanic voters and African-American voters are becoming more Republican. Trump's not going to win a majority of Hispanic voters or African-American voters, but potentially enough could move to the Republicans to shift some states in Trump's direction. Again, Michigan and Pennsylvania are high on the list. That is also a problem for Joe Biden. That is something that is another imponderable in this campaign. So it's a great deal. There are many, many different layers of uncertainty here. We don't know, for example, who the Republican vice presidential candidate would be. It's unlikely that the candidate is going to make a great deal of positive difference for the Republicans. People vote for president, not for vice president. But a presidential candidate, particularly one who is controversial, can cause a great deal of trouble. A couple of historical examples. 1984, Walter Mondale picked Geraldine Ferraro as his running mate, Representative Ferraro. And there were questions about her husband's business dealings and potential connections to organized crime. Nothing legally happened as a result of those accusations, but it was enough to throw the entire campaign off kilter for several weeks, and that worked to Reagan's advantage. 1988, Dan Quayle. Come back to the 88 campaign. Republicans remember Dan Quayle for Lloyd Benson's classic riposte, Senator, you're no Jack Kennedy, and the very hurt look on Dan Quayle's face. Quayle didn't cost Bush the election, obviously, but a lot of people in the Bush campaign think he cost him maybe 1 or 2 percentage points of the popular vote. Bottom line, a vice presidential candidate probably can't help very much, but the vice presidential candidate can hurt quite a bit. I think what we saw this past weekend, Katie Britt's potential to be Trump's vice presidential candidate took a serious plunge. There was a lot of chatter about her being a running mate. It made sense. She's the youngest woman ever, youngest Republican woman ever elected to the Senate. She would bring regional balance, and it was thought that she would be very telegenic. I don't think people think that way anymore. Just as people came to see Sarah Palin through the lens of Tina Fey, people from this point on are going to see Katie Britt through the lens of Scarlett Johansson, and that's probably not something favorable for her chances. I expect that the Trump people are going to vet vice presidential candidates very carefully to make sure there aren't any scandals or anything else that would bring the candidate unwanted attention. My own guess, and this is only a guess, I don't have any inside information as to who Trump's vice presidential candidate would be. And remember, I did pick Sarah Palin in 2008. I have that months in advance. So my own guess for Trump's running mate would be Governor Kristi Noem of South Dakota. She's very telegenic. She has been a very consistent Trump supporter, unlike Elise Stefanik, who was originally part of the more moderate wing of the Republican Party. Kristi Noem has consistently been more conservative. She has executive experience. She's had time in the House of Representatives, can talk fluently about a whole range of issues. And so I think if I had to bet a nickel, I'd bet it on Kristi Noem. On the Democratic side, obviously, unless something untoward happens, it's going to be Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris. Okay, we get to the election, and it's very, very difficult to predict with any certainty what the popular and electoral vote will be. Most likely, the popular vote will be just a few points either way. It's been that way for a long time. As I mentioned earlier, the last candidate to win a substantial, a 53+% share of the popular vote was Barack Obama, and before him, George H.W. Bush. That hasn't happened in a while. It's more or less a 50-50 country in terms of states. The thing that Biden would worry about in particular are the states affected by the border crisis, especially Arizona. Biden famously and narrowly won Arizona in 2020, but the border crisis could tip that state to Donald Trump this time, and put that together with some other states, and Biden will have a problem in the Electoral College. I don't know if that's going to happen. Probably there are other things that could impact the election, but that's an area of concern for the Biden campaign. And what happens as a result of the election? Well, Congress passed the Electoral Count Act, which would eliminate the possibility of another attempted reversal of the outcome as we saw in 2021. Of course, an obvious difference is this time the vice president in place at the time of the counting of the ballots would still be Kamala Harris. Nevertheless, if there is a very close election, expect the losing side to be extremely unhappy. If Trump loses narrowly, there is a strong possibility that he will say that the election is rigged. At that point, there is a possibility of a violent reaction. It won't play out exactly as it did in 2021, but the danger is there. But it's not the only danger. Let's say Biden loses narrowly. There could be some very unhappy people on that side as well. So we can't discount the possibility of violence on the other side as well. So a couple of things are clear. The next president will be elected very narrowly. It's also quite possible in Congress that we could see for the first time in American history, another first, is that the two chambers of Congress will flip control in opposite directions at the same time. It's very possible the House could go Democratic while the Senate goes Republican. There are several seats in the House that the Democrats are aiming to win. They only have a tiny, tiny margin, got tinier today with the announced resignation of Representative Ken Buck. And there are a number of states in the Senate that Republicans are eager to win, especially John Tester's seat in Montana. There are other seats that Republicans could win as well. Consequently, the next president is likely to face a divided Congress with narrow majorities in each chamber. That's going to make it very difficult for the next president to accomplish his goals through the legislative process. On that happy note, I wanted to leave lots of time for questions, and so I yield the floor to Evan and all of your questions and comments.
Great. Thank you very much, Professor Pitney. All right. As I mentioned, there are a couple of ways we could do this. The first is entering something into the chat box. That's probably the easiest, or virtually raising your hand as well. So I'm going to go into the chat box first before I jump to John, as I had a couple come in the chat box first. So to start, Trevor Belts has heard and read a lot of lackluster feelings towards both candidates from parts of their respective parties. What's the likelihood that either candidate sees an undervote from their voters across the party lines?
That's an excellent question and a real possibility. And that's why, again, I don't mean to be Debbie Downer here. Apologies to those of you named Debbie. But both candidates are will motivate their support through fear. The people supporting Joe Biden are going to talk about the things that Trump would do if he were president. And the supporters of President Trump are casting Biden as representing the forces of communism. And Trump has explicitly and repeatedly used that term. In the 2020 campaign, Trump really went over the top in a fear appeal, saying that if Biden were elected, and this is a direct quote, there will be no God. Well, fortunately, God seems to have survived the Biden election, but I expect Trump to issue similar warnings this time. And the rhetoric on both sides is going to be very heated. And if it's successful, that will motivate the turnout. But the turnout will not be motivated by an appeal to our better angels, but to our deepest fears.
Thank you, Art. I'm going to go to the hand raised. So we'll start with John and then Mark. Then we'll go to the chat, and then we'll come back to Howard, going in order. So everyone, please keep your question asking to a minute or less. John, go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Sure, thank you. Hi, Professor Pitney, Yanni Nicolau, 2019. Thank you again for hosting these. They're always very informative and useful. So I learned a lot about how the RNC works and the importance of party machinery in your course. And I was very curious the recent developments at the RNC. Do you think that the Trump organization co-opting it and it perhaps turning into a piggy bank for legal fees would have any negative effects on the critical role the party plays in getting voter turnout, like actual organization, mobilization, and actually?
Yeah, I think that's a legitimate concern. As a lot of you know,
Going. Thank you.
I'm sorry. Yeah, as a lot of you know, I worked at the Republican National Committee, so I have some firsthand experience here. And if I were a Republican donor, I might think twice about where I put my money. Right now, it appears that a lot of that Republican money at the Republican National Committee is going to go to Trump's personal expenses and legal fees. And the evidence for this is the reported plan to move the finance office to Palm Beach, Florida. That kind of suggests a very personal interest on the part of Trump, not so much about the overall good of the Republican Party. Now, to get into the weeds, I suspect a lot of Republican donors will switch their giving to the National Republican Congressional Committee, the Senatorial Committee, and individual candidates. But you really need a strong national party committee to motivate the turnout, to engage in a lot of party activities, and leave aside one's feelings about Trump. It's not at all clear, as the track record of past elections indicates, that they're up to running the party at this level. We'll see.
Thank you.
All right, Mark, if you would unmute and ask a question.
Thank you. I'd like to ask specifically about low voter turnout and who benefits. I know in the primary election, LA County had less than 20% vote. That's not the national. But if people stay home or don't vote, who's the beneficiary of that? And what level of registered voter participation would you anticipate in the 2024 presidential election?
Another great question. The cop-out answer would be, well, it depends on whose voters stay home. And there's something to that. In the past, there was a thought that one of the things that brought down Hillary Clinton in 2016 was low voter turnout on the part of young people in key states. If younger people had turned out in higher numbers in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, she might well have carried those states and won the election. This time out, younger people seem to be disengaged more from politics than they were at least in 2020. And that is potentially a huge problem for Joe Biden. And another problem he has in appealing to younger people is he's not getting any younger himself. And that's something that all of my students seem to have noticed. And that's going to be an issue that he will deal with by raising fears of Donald Trump. My students are reluctant about Biden, but a lot of them aren't crazy about Trump either, and that's putting it mildly. As far as turnout goes, again, the metric used voter eligible population. I suspect it will end up being a fairly high turnout in the end because voters on both sides are going to perceive enormously high stakes in this election. Each side is going to portray this election as an existential struggle. Democrats will say, and Republicans too, will say, this is the most important election of our lifetimes. Politicians always say that, but this time, millions and millions of Americans are going to go to the polls believing it. So I actually expect a relatively high voter turnout. Again, however, the question is individual groups. Even though the overall number might be high, if Biden underperforms among younger voters, he's going to have a tremendous problem. If Biden underperforms among Black and Hispanic voters, he's going to have a tremendous problem. Those are things to look at.
All right, I'm going to jump to the chat for a little bit, so hang tight, Howard. We'll get to you shortly. Why do you think Nikki Haley didn't get more support?
Simple. She wasn't Donald Trump.
Hmm.
Voters, again, after Trump's first indictment, Republican voters nationwide circled the wagons around Donald Trump. That's why Ron DeSantis wasn't able to make it. There's a lot of commentary that he was a rotten candidate, that he made Richard Nixon seem like Tom Hanks by comparison. That and all of which is true. I wouldn't want to go camping with a guy. But in the end, that isn't the reason he lost. He lost because he wasn't Trump. He was trying to be, a Trump alternative without really offering an actual alternative to Trump. Nikki Haley tried to energize the never Trump people. Unfortunately for her, within the Republican Party, that's only a sliver of the vote. Is telling that the one state that she carried, Vermont, was a state in which Democrats and independents could participate in the Republican primary. Although there weren't any exit polls, I would bet a lot of money that most of Nikki Haley's vote in Vermont actually came from people who identified as Democrats or independents. So this was a foreordained outcome from the beginning. Trump might have done something to blow it, but he was able to mobilize the passions and the resentments of Republican voters, and he's their guy.
Thank you. Does either candidate have an advantage in the Electoral College not reflected in the polls?
I think this is a great question. Overall, I would say that Trump would have an advantage only because Republicans have built an enormous lead in rural states and rural areas. And if you look at, if you do the arithmetic of the Electoral College, small states are overrepresented relative to their share of the population. That's because of the structure of the Electoral College. Every state gets at least 3 electors, no matter how small it is. So that gives Trump a bit of an edge in 2016. He also benefited by Clinton's mistakes in Michigan. I mentioned before, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. Democrats are going to focus on those states this time. But they have to watch their underperformance among younger voters, which is what helped kill Clinton's candidacy in 2016.
Thank you. All right, Howard, if you want to unmute and ask your question.
Sure. Hi, Professor. We sat in on your Congress class over family weekend, and this is a hypothetical question about Congress.
Sure.
If Trump wins, and if Republicans win narrow majorities in the House and the Senate, do you think there's any chance he might push the new Senate leader to abolish the filibuster and get his program through?
I think that's a great question. I think it's something that could happen with or without Trump. One reason the filibuster persisted was through previous stretches of Republican control is that Mitch McConnell actually was kind of an institutionalist. I know people who disagreed with him on the Supreme Court would raise their eyebrows at that, but he generally, even when the Republicans were in the majority, continued to support the filibuster on legislation because he was smart enough to know that the majority would change over time and Republicans might want to exercise the filibuster. However, I think your point is very well taken. If Trump wants this, and if Republicans see an advantage in the next couple of years, it's something they're going to do. So yeah, I think if the Republicans win a narrow majority in the Senate and Trump wants this, yeah, I think it'll happen. So it's a good point.
Kevin Goodwin asks, it seems that voters on both sides are pretty locked in their positions. Does this election come down to who can turn their voters out?
Yes, it's a combination of turnout and persuasion, but persuasion of a very, very narrow band of voters. The persuadables are out there, but it's not like 1988. Remember, I showed that graph at the beginning. In 1988, there actually were a lot of voters up for grabs, and there were states that were up for grabs. And if you look at the map of 1988, it's stunning about which candidates won which states. 1988, California voted for Bush. In 1988, Iowa and West Virginia voted for Dukakis. And lots of voters were open to changing their minds, which is why Dukakis went from a 17-point lead to a 6-point defeat. We just don't have that this time. Most states are locked in. Spoiler alert, Biden's going to carry California. But there are a few states that are on the bubble, and there are a small number of voters who are on the bubble, and they could be decisive. And again, coming back to my point about negative campaigning, both sides are going to raise existential fears about the other. And to the extent that they succeed, that's what's going to motivate their turnout.
Given the age of both candidates, what happens if one passes away before the election?
I knew this would come up. Okay, I saved this discussion for the question. Okay. By the way, the answer to this question gets into the realm that this is where political science shades into fan fiction, because we don't have a good basis on which to make firm forecasts. Let's say this happens before the conventions. At that point, the delegates to the conventions are free agents. Let's say, God forbid, something happens to Joe Biden. Well, Kamala Harris is not automatically the nominee at that point, even if she should succeed to the presidency. Delegates are by no means bound to support her. There could be another candidate. Rumor has it that Gavin Newsom might potentially be interested in that job. That's just merely a rumor. I don't know why anybody would think that. I'm being sarcastic. And there are lots of other Democratic candidates. A lot of Democrats have thought favorably of Gretchen Whitmer, governor of Michigan. She might enter the race. Who knows what would happen? Bottom line, though, it would be up to the delegates. And we have not had anything resembling a truly open convention since the 1950s. 1976, there was some question whether it would be Reagan or Ford, but at least you knew it would be one or the other. This is a free-for-all, the likes of which has not happened in the political experience of anybody involved in politics today. After the convention, the nominee would be selected by the Democratic National Committee. And here we do have a precedent. The precedent is 1972, when the vice presidential candidate of the Democratic Party, Thomas Eagleton, had to withdraw because of revelations that he had recently, a couple of years recently, undergone electroconvulsive therapy for severe depression. Now, today we'd be much more accepting of that, but in 1972, a lot of people thought that was a major scandal. And he also got in trouble because he didn't disclose this to the presidential candidate, George McGovern. So the Democratic National Committee looked for another candidate. Ted Kennedy turned him down, so they turned to the next best thing, a Kennedy in-law, Sergeant Shriver. So that's how Marie Shriver's dad got to be the Democratic presidential candidate in 1972. And that didn't work out well for, he was a fine candidate, but McGovern lost the election to Nixon. So would that be end up with the national committees? But whom they would pick, who knows? We are way out where the buses don't run in that case.
Thank you. Okay. Chuck and Michael, I think that also answered your questions. If not, put something else in the chat to me. Jen Lee says, what about the impact of foreign interference in the election? And if so, by whom?
Yes, this is also an excellent question because we have seen it. In the 2016 campaign, Russia used Facebook and social media to sow dissension in the United States. It's not so much that they really wanted to elect one candidate or another, but they wanted Americans to fight each other, which is why, for example, the Russians have promoted pro-vaccine and anti-vaccine messages in Facebook and other platforms. They just want Americans against each other. It's possible that we're going to see this through other media as well. The Russians have gotten more clever about covering their tracks. But the big question is, can they actually change the results of the election? Can they tamper with the actual results? That seems unlikely. And part of the saving grace of the American electoral system is its inefficiency and complexity. A lot of people complain, wow, this is a real kludge of a system. 50 states, thousands of counties, tens of thousands of jurisdictions, all counting votes in their own way. But that actually is a bulwark against foreign interference because there's no central depository of votes that the Russians or anybody else could tamper with. So that's one thing we have going for us.
How do you characterize Democrats' overperformance in almost all recent elections after 2020? How do you factor in Roe v. Wade for women voters?
That's a big deal. If I had to pick the biggest thing that's going in Biden's favor, it's that. Because when he talks about democracy, surprisingly few voters are moved by that. People who study political science are concerned about the future of the separation of powers. But the last time I was in line at Ralph's, I didn't hear anybody worrying about the separation of powers. Abortion is different. That affects people in the most personal kind of way possible. People understand the issue. They know what it's about. They don't have to take out a book to understand what a ban on abortion would do. So consequently, that has worked to the Democrats' advantage. Before Dobbs, it was a very different kind of an issue because people did support certain kinds of restrictions on abortion. So long as they thought that abortion was basically illegal, they might support certain kinds of limitations on it. But Dobbs changed the terms of debate radically. And in the end, the polls showed that that issue strongly favors the Democrats. And if Biden squeaks through, he can thank Sam Alito.
Middle East politics are obviously dragging on Biden's poll numbers right now. If there were to be a seemingly lasting ceasefire before the fall, do you think that the situation will continue to be a drag on the president, or do you think voters will move on to focus on something else?
I think the Middle East is a concern for some voters. Again, most voters not so much because most American voters don't focus on foreign policy unless it directly involves American lives and American interests. However, in key states, again, I mentioned Michigan being top of the list. This is a voting issue for a significant segment of the electorate. And if there is a ceasefire that cools the passions surrounding the issue, Biden can make the case, you might not be happy with my policies, but look at the other guy. This is the guy who openly said, I think Islam hates us, and openly called for a ban on Muslims entering the United States. I think in the end, the shift to Trump or the shift to undecided will be relatively small. And Biden would benefit from some kind of cessation of hostilities in the Middle East. But this is a problem for him. The passions remain, and he still has to deal with voters who are extremely unhappy with his policies in the region.
What is your view of the Republican Party bifurcation of MAGA Republicans and non-MAGA Republicans?
Well, there aren't that many non-MAGA Republicans left, at least at the level of the party in government and elected officials. They're pretty much all gone, except for David Valadao. The Republicans who voted to impeach President Trump after January 6th are gone. If you're a Republican and you have private misgivings about Trump, you consider the fate of Liz Cheney. She was a member of the Republican leadership. She was Republican royalty. And not only did she get ousted from the leadership, she resoundingly lost her primary. There are some non-MAGA Republicans left in the electorate, but not that many. If you look at the results of the primaries, Trump won overwhelmingly. Nobody was forcing voters to support him. So the Republican Party is very much a Trump party.
Many see the 6 core states for this election being Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada. Do you think the Democratic governors in all those states will play a significant role, and how will the Senate races in those states impact the presidential election?
I think, it's always handy to have a governor because governors have political organizations of their own. They have turnout machines. They can be extremely helpful. Nevertheless, you look at Georgia. Georgia had a Republican governor in 2020, a very skillful Republican governor. Nevertheless, Biden was able to carry the state. So that's not really a guarantee of victory. As far as Senate elections go, one of the things that Democrats are hoping for is that certain Democratic candidates in those states might be able to gain from their Republican opponents. I'm thinking in particular in the state of Arizona, Ruben Gallego is likely to face Kari Lake. And Kari Lake could end up turning off a lot of voters who might otherwise support a Republican candidate. Now, is that going to have much of an impact on the presidential election? That remains to be seen. But I'm sure that the people who were running the Republican Party nationwide would quietly prefer a more mainstream candidate in a state like that.
Will the new RNC support a Republican candidate that is not aligned with Trump, but very viable, such as Larry Hogan in Maryland? And perhaps that's not necessarily this cycle, but soon.
No. Hogan will be on his own, which is fine because he is very capable of raising his own money. And more important, the National Republican Senatorial Committee is going to support Republican Senate candidates no matter what. That's their job. So Hogan would probably like to have support from the National Committee, but in his case, he has national visibility and national fundraising base. I would still say that election is very much uphill because Republicans have not won a Senate election in Maryland in decades. They've won the governorship a few times, but governor's elections are very different from Senate elections.
How big of an issue do you think abortion will be on this election?
Abortion is going to be huge. As I mentioned earlier, it's one of the reasons why Joe Biden is still very much in the game. It's something that voters care about very much. It will motivate a lot of women voters, but not just women voters, to go to the polls. This is the classic case of what happens when the dog catches the car. Republicans have been talking about this issue for years. They didn't really have a great plan for what happened if and when the Supreme Court actually overturned Roe v. Wade. The recent back and forth over IVF is an example. A lot of Republican legislators in both the House and the Senate had previously co-sponsored legislation declaring that life began at conception. The effect of that legislation would essentially be to outlaw IVF. So now they have to backtrack and say how much they support it. That's not a great position to be in politically.
Why are indictments a reason to circle the wagon for Republicans, yet a potential conviction may negatively impact Trump's chances with at least certain Republicans? Seems contradictory.
Well, an indictment, it's a great question. And the reason is an indictment is launched by a prosecutor. And Trump has been arguing, well, we have these Democrat Trump-hating prosecutors at both the state and federal level. In the case of Jack Smith, that is, to put it mildly, a stretch. So the indictment is really a product of prosecutorial efforts. Now, technically, a grand jury has to act, but the lawyers on this call probably recall the old saying that a good prosecutor can get a grand jury to indict a ham sandwich. A criminal conviction in a trial is a different animal. A criminal conviction renders the defendant from somebody who has the presumption of innocence to somebody who is a convicted criminal, a felon. That label carries weight. Will it carry enough weight to sway the election? We have absolutely no idea, and that's one of the great imponderables of this campaign, but it's an excellent question.
Thank you. All right, we're Getting close to the end here. Is what happened in Alabama going to re-energize the pro-choice voters since the overturning of Roe v. Wade is increasingly in the rearview mirror? Kind of.
Yes, what we've seen is the number of people who have some connection to the whole phenomenon of IVF, people who have undergone it, have considered it, might want to consider it in the future. That ends up being a significant number of voters. And I'd expect Democrats to talk about that. I'd expect them to talk about other aspects of the issue as well. The states that are passing restrictive legislation and the people who have had to change their lives as a result of the restrictive legislation. I absolutely guarantee you the Democratic National Convention will feature testimonies by people in that category. So it's potentially a very, very powerful issue for the Democrats going forward because it has so many different branches to it, so many different iterations affecting so many people in so many ways.
Where do you think the Nikki Haley voters will go? Are they going to stay home in November, or are they going to go for Trump? Or are they going to go independent? Where do you think they'll go?
Great question. I think it depends on where they started from. If you're in a state where only registered Republicans can participate, probably the vast majority of Nikki Haley voters will vote for Donald Trump. And if you talk to them, they'll say, well, I'm not crazy about Trump, but Joe Biden is the devil. Now, if you look at the independents and Democrats who voted for Haley in open primaries, different story. Probably a majority of them will vote for Biden, but the polls indicated a majority of them would have voted for Biden anyway. So I'm not sure that the Haley vote is really that much of a thing.
So this will be our last question before we conclude and say our goodbyes. Do you think there's ever a time where in the future where we won't have to worry about violence around elections or violence between parties?
Oh, God. I really hope so. We've had political violence in the past. I came of age watching the 1968 conventions. There was political violence there, but it was a different kind. It wasn't that supporters of Nixon were battling supporters of Humphrey in the streets. It was something that was confined to a particular place, issues involving the convention and protests and the rest. This is something that we haven't seen on a large scale in American politics, really, since the Civil War era. So I hope that whatever happens in this election, we can get past it, because if it continues, that's extremely bad for our country.
All right, I guess one more question, and if it's too early to tell, that's fine too. Who do you predict will win in November, Trump or Biden?
If the election were held today, Trump would win. But the election isn't being held today. As I said at the beginning, many, many different kinds of things could happen to tip it to one candidate or the other. So all I can say is it's not going to be Robert Kennedy. It's going to be Joe Biden or Donald Trump, and that person is probably going to win by only a couple of points at most. I wish I could be more definitive, but given the uncertainties involved in this election, that's the best I can say.
Thank you for Professor Pitney. We appreciate your time and continued engagement and commitment to CMC and to our alumni and our parents as well. To our entire audience, we hope to see you on future programs. We have one with Hillary Apple on Ukraine. We also have a virtual Pinot Noir wine tasting end of March. Hope to see you all back very soon. Feel free to unmute, say hello, say goodbye, and we will see you on the next program.
Thanks, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Evan.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Professor Pitney. Really appreciate it.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Jill.
Hello, Jill.
Hi. Hi.
Good evening.
I see you. I see you both.
Some of the old friends.
John.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Kevin.